The moment the waitress spoke Arabic, $7 billion stopped moving. Rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Grand Mercer like tiny bullets of silver light, while Manhattan glowed cold and distant beneath the storm. Inside the private dining hall, crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble tables where some of the most powerful men in international finance sat pretending they weren't nervous. Adrian Keller noticed every twitch anyway. He always did. That was why, at 39 years old, he owned half the skyline visible through the glass behind him. Fear had built his empire almost as much as intelligence. "Mr. Keller," his assistant whispered carefully beside him. "The Al Masri delegation has arrived." Adrian adjusted the cuff of his charcoal Brioni suit and glanced at the antique Swiss watch on his wrist. 10 minutes late. Deliberate. A power move. He almost smiled. Across the room, waiters moved silently between tables carrying $1,000 bottles of wine with surgical precision. None of them mattered. Adrian rarely looked twice at service staff anymore. They existed in the background of his world like shadows carrying trays. Invisible. Replaceable. But tonight, one of those shadows would change everything. The doors opened slowly. Sheikh Hassan al-Masri entered first, draped in elegant dark robes that contrasted sharply against the white marble floor. Behind him followed attorneys, advisors, and translators. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Even the music from the grand piano near the bar seemed quieter. Adrian stepped forward with a controlled smile. "Sheikh Hassan, welcome to New York." The older man nodded once. "Mr. Keller." No warmth. No handshake. Just calculation. Dinner began carefully. Expensive plates arrived untouched, while numbers worth more than most countries floated calmly across the table. Adrian stayed composed, though he noticed the sheik growing colder every time the translator spoke. Small things. Tiny pauses. Subtle glances exchanged in Arabic too quickly for anyone else to catch. Then it happened. The sheik suddenly placed his glass down with a sharp crack against the table. Every conversation in the room died. "This contract insults me," he said in Arabic, voice low but razor sharp. The translator froze. Sweat formed instantly near his collar. "He says," the translator began nervously, "he believes there may be confusion regarding the partnership percentages." Adrian's eyes narrowed. That wasn't right. He didn't speak Arabic fluently, but he knew enough to recognize one word the sheik had repeated twice. Betrayal. The room tightened around him. Executives shifted in their chairs. One investor quietly reached for his phone beneath the table. Adrian felt the deal slipping away by the second. Then, from somewhere behind the wine bar, a calm female voice spoke in flawless Arabic. He did not say partnership. Silence crashed across the room. A waitress stepped forward carrying a silver tray against her hip. Blonde hair tied neatly back. Black uniform perfectly pressed. Blue eyes steady. He said someone altered the ownership clause after the final review. The translator went pale. Adrian stared at her as if the entire restaurant had suddenly tilted sideways. The waitress gently placed the tray down beside the champagne bucket and looked directly at Sheikh Hassan. Then she continued speaking Arabic so naturally that even the older advisors sat straighter in their seats. The sheikh's expression changed instantly. Not anger anymore. Respect. Genuine respect. Adrian could barely breathe as the mysterious waitress calmly exposed the sentence hidden inside the contract that none of his legal team had caught. And for the first time in years, Adrian Keller realized he was no longer the smartest person in the room. No one moved for nearly 5 full seconds after the waitress finished speaking. The rain outside continued sliding down the glass walls of the Grand Mercer, but inside the private dining room, even the sound of silverware had disappeared. Adrian Keller stared at the woman beside the champagne cart as if his mind could not fully process what had just happened. She stood there calmly, one hand resting lightly against the silver tray, her breathing steady while billionaires and international attorneys looked at her with open disbelief. Sheikh Hassan slowly turned toward the translator. "You omitted that section intentionally," he said in English this time, his voice dangerously calm. The translator's face drained of color. "Sir, I can explain." "No," the sheik replied quietly. "You already explained enough." One of Adrian's legal advisors immediately grabbed the contract from the table, flipping pages with trembling hands until he found the altered clause buried near the end of the document. Ownership transfer, not partnership distribution. Someone had changed the language carefully enough that only a fluent Arabic speaker with legal knowledge would notice. Adrian felt cold realization settle into his chest. If the contract had been signed tonight, he could have lost partial control of one of the largest energy acquisitions in the world. And the only person who caught it had been a waitress carrying wine glasses. Adrian rose slowly from his chair. "What is your name?" he asked. The woman looked at him directly for the first time. Her blue eyes were calm in a way that unsettled him. Most people either feared him or admired him. She did neither. "Vivian Hale," she answered softly. Her voice carried no pride, no nervousness, just quiet certainty. Sheikh Hassan stood up next. To everyone's shock, the older billionaire placed his hand over his heart respectfully toward Vivian before speaking to her in Arabic again. She answered immediately. Smooth. Effortless. One of the Arab investors near the end of the table gave a stunned laugh beneath his breath. "Her accent," he murmured quietly. "It is nearly perfect." Adrian noticed every reaction in the room shifting toward her. The same executives who ignored her 15 minutes earlier were now watching her like she had stepped out of another world entirely. Vivian reached down and lifted the tray again. "Your table requested another bottle of Bordeaux," she said politely toward Adrian's side of the room, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Then she turned and walked away beneath the warm chandelier light, disappearing back into the restaurant crowd. Adrian remained standing. His assistant stepped closer carefully. "Should I call security?" Adrian shook his head once without taking his eyes off the hallway where Vivian vanished. "No. Then what do you want me to do?" Adrian adjusted the silver cuff on his sleeve slowly. "Find out who she really is." Across the restaurant, Vivian moved between tables with the same quiet grace as before, refilling water, collecting empty plates, smiling politely at customers who never realized the woman serving them had just prevented an international disaster. But Adrian noticed something else now. The details, the precision of her movements, the way she listened before people spoke, the way she scanned exits automatically whenever doors opened. She did not move like a waitress. She moved like someone trained to stay calm when everyone else lost control. 20 minutes later, Adrian barely heard the conversation around him anymore. The deal had been postponed until morning. His attorneys were panicking quietly in another room. But Adrian's attention kept drifting back toward Vivian. Then, as she passed his table carrying fresh glasses, he spoke without thinking. "Where did you learn Arabic?" Vivian stopped for half a second. Just half a second. But Adrian noticed. She looked down at the crystal glasses in her hands before answering softly. "Some languages are learned because people want opportunities." Her eyes lifted toward his. "Others are learned because survival leaves no choice." Then she walked away again, leaving Adrian Keller sitting silently beneath the chandelier glow while, for the first time in years, he realized money could not buy the answers he wanted. By midnight, Adrian Keller had signed documents worth more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. But none of it stayed in his mind as clearly as the image of Vivian Hale carrying champagne glasses through the golden light of the Grand Mercer. The restaurant had slowly emptied after the disaster with the contract. Luxury sedans disappeared into the rain outside one by one, while exhausted employees cleared crystal plates beneath dim chandeliers. Yet Adrian remained seated alone near the window overlooking Lexington Avenue, staring absently at the untouched bourbon in front of him. His assistant, Daniel, approached carefully with a tablet in hand. "Preliminary background report," he said quietly. Adrian took the tablet without answering. The screen displayed only fragments. Vivian Hale, 28 years old. No recent tax filings beyond restaurant income. No public social media accounts. No active LinkedIn profile. No university records accessible online. It felt wrong immediately. People did not disappear this completely anymore. Especially not educated people. Adrian scrolled lower. Then he stopped. A single archived reference appeared beneath sealed federal restrictions. U.S. Department of State Internship Clearance Review. Access denied. Adrian's jaw tightened slightly. Waitresses did not have restricted diplomatic records. Daniel lowered his voice. "There is more." Adrian looked up. "Go on." "Someone erased parts of her digital footprint around 4 years ago. Very professionally." Adrian leaned back slowly. Rainwater traced silver lines down the glass beside him while taxi headlights blurred across the streets below. "Debt?" he asked. Daniel shook his head. "Nothing major." No criminal history. No lawsuits. No luxury purchases either. Family. One younger sister. Emily Hale. 17 years old. Daniel hesitated. Chronic cardiac condition. Adrian's eyes shifted slightly. Hospital records? Mostly private. Silence settled between them. Across the room, Vivian appeared again near the service station, rolling silverware into linen napkins beside another waitress who chatted loudly about weekend plans. Vivian barely spoke. She listened more than she talked. Every movement remained calm, efficient, controlled. Adrian noticed something strange again. Even after a 12-hour shift, she never looked careless, never distracted. People under stress revealed themselves eventually. But Vivian seemed trained not to. "You were staring at her," Daniel muttered carefully. Adrian did not deny it. "She prevented an international catastrophe tonight and embarrassed half your legal department." Adrian almost smiled at that. Almost. Then Vivian glanced toward his table unexpectedly. Their eyes met across the quiet restaurant. Most people looked away first when Adrian Keller noticed them. Vivian did not. She simply held his gaze calmly for one brief moment before returning to her work. No fear. No admiration. Nothing. Somehow that unsettled him more than hostility would have. 30 minutes later, Adrian finally stood to leave. Employees were stacking chairs now, while soft jazz drifted through the nearly empty room. As he reached the front entrance, he noticed Vivian outside beneath the awning, adjusting a thin gray coat against the rain. She looked smaller without the restaurant lights around her. Human. Tired. Adrian should have walked past her. Instead, he stopped. "Miss Hale." Vivian turned slowly. Raindrops shimmered against the dark Manhattan sidewalk behind her. "Mr. Keller, you saved me tonight." Her expression remained unreadable. "I saved your contract." Adrian slipped his hands into his coat pockets. Most people would have stayed quiet. Vivian looked out toward the rain-covered street for a moment before answering. "Most people are afraid of powerful men." Adrian studied her carefully. "And you are not." She gave the faintest hint of a smile. Sad more than amused. "Power does not frighten me anymore." Before Adrian could respond, an old black sedan pulled up beside the curb. Vivian opened the passenger door quietly. Then she paused and looked back at him one last time. "Be careful who you trust tomorrow, Mr. Keller." Adrian frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" Vivian hesitated. For the first time all night, uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "It means the contract was not the only thing changed tonight." Then she closed the car door softly and disappeared into the Manhattan rain, leaving Adrian standing motionless beneath the hotel lights, while somewhere deep in his instincts, danger began quietly waking up. Adrian Keller slept less than 90 minutes that night. By 6:30 in the morning, the rain had stopped over Manhattan, leaving the city wrapped in cold gray light, while financial markets across 3 continents waited for his decision on the Al Masri acquisition. Normally, pressure sharpened him. Today it only made him restless. Vivian Hale's final words kept replaying in his head. The contract was not the only thing changed tonight. Adrian stood beside the glass wall of his penthouse office overlooking Central Park, while his executive team gathered around the conference table behind him. Screens glowed with market forecasts and acquisition numbers worth billions of dollars. Yet none of it felt stable anymore. "We completed another review of the contract revisions," Daniel said carefully. "There were additional edits made to the internal transfer schedules." Adrian turned slowly. "Unauthorized?" "Yes." The room grew tense immediately. One executive adjusted his tie nervously. Another reached for coffee with slightly trembling fingers. Adrian noticed everything. He always noticed everything. "How many people had access?" he asked quietly. 6. Silence settled across the room. Adrian walked back toward the table with controlled steps, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the dark wood floor. "Then one of those 6 people is either incompetent or dishonest." Nobody answered. Outside the windows, helicopters drifted above the city skyline, while the first pale sunlight reflected off towers of steel and glass. Adrian rested both hands against the table and looked carefully at each face in front of him. Men he had trusted for years. Men who built fortunes beside him. Suddenly they all looked unfamiliar. "Lock all transfer permissions until further notice," Adrian ordered. "No one touches the Al Masri files without direct authorization from me." "Understood," Daniel replied immediately. Adrian glanced toward another executive sitting near the end of the table. "Richard Lawson." senior financial strategist. 20 years older than most of the team. Calm under pressure. Usually. But this morning Richard avoided eye contact for the third time in 10 minutes. Tiny details. Tiny cracks. Adrian filed it away silently. 2 hours later, the emergency meeting ended with no resolution. Investors demanded reassurance. Lawyers demanded time. Everyone demanded answers Adrian could not yet provide. But beneath all the corporate chaos, one thought kept returning like a quiet echo. Vivian knew something. More than she admitted. Adrian hated uncertainty. By noon, he found himself doing something he had not done in years. He left the office without security, without assistance, without announcements. The black Maybach moved through crowded Manhattan streets while Adrian stared absently out the tinted window. Construction noise echoed between buildings. Steam rose from subway grates. People hurried through crosswalks carrying coffee and briefcases, unaware that entire economies shifted quietly above them every day. Finally, the driver slowed beside a narrow street on the Lower East Side. Vivian's second job. A small cafe called Bellamy's. Nothing luxurious. Just warm yellow lights, old wooden floors, and handwritten menu boards near the windows. Adrian stepped inside and immediately noticed her behind the counter. Vivian looked up briefly while pouring coffee into paper cups. No surprise crossed her face when she saw him. Somehow she already expected him to come. "You are early," she said softly. Adrian frowned slightly. "You expected me?" Vivian handed a customer their order before answering. Men like you do not sleep well when they lose control. Adrian studied her carefully. Morning sunlight touched the edges of her blonde hair, while jazz music played quietly somewhere behind the espresso machine. She looked younger here, less guarded, but only slightly. "You warned me," Adrian said. "Why?" Vivian wiped her hands slowly on a small towel. "Because you were about to trust the wrong people." "Who?" She shook her head once. "If I tell you directly, you will not believe me yet." Adrian stepped closer to the counter. "Try me." For a moment Vivian said nothing. Then she reached beneath the register and slid a folded receipt across the wood toward him. Adrian opened it slowly. A series of numbers had been written carefully in blue ink beside a Manhattan address and one specific time. Tonight, 9:30. Adrian looked up sharply. "What is this?" Vivian's eyes met his calmly. "The moment your world changes again." Before Adrian could speak, the cafe door opened behind him and cold air rushed inside. Vivian's expression changed instantly. Not fear. Recognition. She lowered her voice almost to a whisper. "Do not turn around." Immediately, Adrian felt every instinct inside him sharpen. "Why?" Vivian picked up another coffee cup with perfectly steady hands. "Because the man who just walked in works for someone already inside your company." Adrian kept his eyes forward exactly as Vivian instructed while the cafe door closed softly behind him. Cold December air drifted through Bellamy's for a brief moment before disappearing beneath the smell of espresso and fresh bread. Somewhere behind him, a man stepped toward the counter with calm, measured footsteps. Vivian picked up a menu without the slightest tremor in her hands. "Good afternoon," she said politely. "What can I get started for you?" Adrian reached slowly for the black coffee she had placed in front of him moments earlier, using the reflection in the cafe window to study the figure behind him without turning directly. Mid-40s, dark overcoat, athletic posture. Not a businessman. Not exactly security either. The man removed leather gloves carefully before speaking. "Black coffee. No sugar." His voice was controlled, almost emotionless. Vivian nodded once and turned toward the espresso machine. Adrian noticed something strange immediately. Every employee in the cafe continued working normally, but the atmosphere itself had changed. Quieter somehow. Tighter. Like invisible tension had slipped into the room unnoticed by everyone except the two people standing near the register. The man glanced briefly toward Adrian's reflection in the glass. Recognition flashed across his face for less than a second before disappearing again. That tiny reaction told Adrian everything. He knew exactly who Adrian Keller was. Vivian placed the coffee on the counter. "Anything else?" "No." The man slid cash forward. "Clean bills." No hesitation. Vivian handed back exact change without looking down once. Then the man left as calmly as he entered. Adrian waited 3 full seconds before turning toward the door. Across the street, the man stepped into a black SUV that immediately disappeared into Manhattan traffic. "Who was that?" Adrian asked quietly. Vivian exhaled slowly for the first time since the man entered. Someone who should not know my face. Adrian stared at her. You are speaking in riddles again. Because plain answers get people hurt. Vivian walked toward the end of the counter and began wiping an already clean surface simply to keep moving. Adrian followed her with his eyes carefully. You recognized him immediately. Yes. From where? Vivian remained silent. Outside the cafe window, people rushed along the sidewalk carrying umbrellas and paper cups while yellow taxis splashed through wet streets. Ordinary life continued only inches away from the conversation quietly unfolding inside Bellamy's. Adrian lowered his voice. You said he works for someone inside my company. Vivian finally looked at him again. Richard Lawson. Adrian's expression hardened instantly. That is impossible. Is it? She asked softly. Adrian shook his head once. Richard has been with me for 12 years. And people change after 12 years. Not Richard. Vivian gave him a long, unreadable look. You trust loyalty too easily for someone as powerful as you. Adrian felt irritation rise in his chest. And you trust nobody. A faint shadow crossed Vivian's face. Not anger. Something older. Sadder. Trust is expensive, she said quietly. Most people cannot afford it twice. Before Adrian could answer, the small bell above the cafe door rang again. An elderly woman entered slowly with a cane in one hand and grocery bags in the other. Vivian moved instantly. Not dramatically. Not for attention. She simply stepped around the counter and relieved the woman of the heavy bags before the customer could even ask for help. Your usual tea? Vivian asked gently. The woman smiled warmly. You always remember. Adrian watched silently as Vivian guided her carefully toward a seat by the window. The older woman touched Vivian's hand affectionately before sitting down. Tiny details. Tiny moments. But Adrian noticed them all. Vivian returned to the counter a minute later, and for the first time since meeting her, Adrian saw exhaustion behind her calm expression. Why are you helping me? He asked suddenly. Vivian paused. Because someone should. That is not an answer. She looked down briefly at the silver watch on her wrist. Old. Scratched. Clearly valuable once. 4 years ago, she said softly. Someone inside your company destroyed more than money. Adrian's pulse slowed. What does that mean? Vivian's blue eyes lifted toward his again. This time there was no distance in them. Only warning. It means tonight at 9:30, you are finally going to learn what your empire really cost other people. At exactly 9:23 that night, Adrian Keller stood across the street from the Manhattan address Vivian had written on the cafe receipt, while cold wind moved between the buildings like a warning. The location made no sense. It was not a corporate office, not a luxury hotel, just an old brick building near the East River with dark windows and a faded sign that read Hawthorne Archive Services. Adrian checked the time on his silver watch again. 9:24. For a man who controlled billion-dollar negotiations without emotion, he hated how uncertain he felt walking toward that door. A black sedan waited quietly near the curb with tinted windows dark enough to hide whoever sat inside. Adrian noticed it immediately. He noticed everything now. Vivian was already there beneath the weak yellow glow of the street lamp. No waitress uniform tonight. She wore a long ivory coat over dark clothes, her blonde hair loose against the wind for the first time since he met her. She looked different outside restaurants and cafes. Colder somehow. Sharper. Like the quiet woman serving coffee had only been one version of her. Adrian approached slowly. You came alone, Vivian said softly. You asked me to. Her eyes searched his face carefully. That was either very brave or very foolish. Adrian glanced toward the old building. You still have not explained what this place is. Vivian looked up at the dark windows. 4 years ago, Hawthorne Archive Services handled confidential storage for private legal and financial records. Adrian frowned slightly. I have never heard of it. You were not supposed to. A taxi splashed through rainwater nearby before disappearing down the avenue. The city around them felt strangely distant tonight. Vivian reached into her coat pocket and removed a small brass key. Old. Worn smooth with time. Adrian watched her carefully. What happened here? Vivian hesitated. For the first time since meeting her, her composure seemed fragile around the edges. People lost everything. She stepped toward the entrance and unlocked the door quietly. Inside, the building smelled faintly of dust and old paper. Emergency lights cast dim amber shadows across rows of metal filing shelves stretching deep into the darkness. Adrian followed Vivian carefully while his footsteps echoed softly through the empty archive room. "Start talking," he said finally. Vivian stopped beside a rusted storage cabinet near the back wall. 4 years ago, a legal transfer connected to Keller Global passed through this building. Adrian's jaw tightened. "What kind of transfer?" Vivian looked directly at him. "One designed to bankrupt smaller companies during overseas acquisitions." Adrian shook his head immediately. "That is impossible. Keller Global does not operate that way." Vivian's expression did not change. "You believe that because people protected you from the details." Adrian felt irritation rising again. "And you know all this because what?" "You worked here." Vivian gave a slow nod. "I translated international contracts." Silence settled heavily between them. Adrian stared at her. "That is why you know Arabic legal terminology." "Among other things." Adrian stepped closer. "Then tell me clearly, what does Richard Lawson have to do with this?" Vivian's fingers tightened slightly around the brass key in her hand. "Richard supervised the transfer operation." Adrian's face hardened. "No, you asked for the truth. Richard built my company beside me." Vivian looked at him quietly for a long moment before speaking again. "And powerful men often trust the people who hide ugly things from them." Adrian opened his mouth to answer when headlights suddenly flashed across the front windows outside. Both of them froze instinctively. A car had stopped near the entrance. Vivian's eyes shifted immediately toward the door. Calm disappeared from her expression for the first time. "We are out of time," she whispered. Adrian heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate. Then a familiar voice echoed faintly through the hallway beyond the entrance. "Vivian." Adrian's blood ran cold instantly. "Richard Lawson." The sound of Richard Lawson's voice inside the archive building changed the entire atmosphere instantly. Adrian felt it beside him. Vivian's breathing slowed carefully, controlled by force rather than calm, while the dim emergency lights painted long shadows across the filing shelves around them. "Vivian." Richard called again from somewhere near the entrance hallway. His tone sounded almost gentle. Familiar. That frightened Adrian more than anger would have. Vivian stepped backward instinctively. Adrian noticed it immediately. Tiny movement. Tiny fear. "You know him personally," Adrian said quietly. Vivian kept her eyes fixed toward the dark hallway. "I used to." Footsteps echoed slowly closer through the building. Richard was not rushing. That meant confidence. Adrian's instincts sharpened further. He lowered his voice. "What exactly happened here 4 years ago?" Vivian looked at him for one long second, as if deciding something important internally. Then she spoke softly. "I translated acquisition contracts for Keller Global's international division. Richard supervised every transfer." Adrian frowned. "You were part of my legal network?" "Temporary contractor," she corrected quietly. "Languages. International review. Compliance verification." Richard's footsteps stopped somewhere beyond the next row of shelves. Silence followed. Heavy silence. "Vivian," Richard said again. "You should not have brought Adrian here." Adrian felt cold irritation rise instantly. Richard knew he was inside the building. Vivian's eyes closed briefly. Not panic. Resignation. "He always knew more than people realized," she whispered. Then Richard appeared at the end of the aisle beneath the weak amber lights. Gray overcoat. Silver hair perfectly neat despite the rain outside. Calm expression unchanged. If Adrian had passed him on the street tonight, he would still look like the same trusted executive who had spent 12 years helping build Keller Global into one of the most powerful firms in the country. That was the disturbing part. Richard looked completely ordinary. "Adrian," Richard said quietly. "You should leave." Adrian stepped slightly in front of Vivian without consciously deciding to. "You altered the contracts." Richard's expression barely shifted. "It is more complicated than that." "Then explain it." Richard glanced toward Vivian briefly before answering. "There are realities attached to billion-dollar acquisitions that idealistic people rarely understand." Vivian's jaw tightened. "You destroyed companies that could not defend themselves." Richard sighed softly, almost tired. "No, I protected Keller Global from competitors who would have done worse." Adrian stared at him in disbelief. "You used my company." Richard finally looked directly at Adrian. "I built your company." The words landed hard inside the silent archive room. Adrian realized with sudden clarity that Richard genuinely believed what he was saying. That was the terrifying thing about intelligent men who crossed moral lines quietly. Eventually, they stopped seeing the lines at all. Vivian stepped forward slowly from behind Adrian. "Tell him about Dubai," she said softly. For the first time that night, something uncertain flickered across Richard's face. Small, brief, but real. Adrian noticed immediately. "Dubai." Richard remained silent. Vivian's voice lowered further. "The Al Nouri acquisition. For years ago." Adrian's pulse slowed dangerously. He remembered that deal. International shipping routes. 3 smaller Middle Eastern firms absorbed during a financial collapse. Aggressive but legal. Or at least he believed it had been legal. Vivian looked directly at Adrian now. The contracts were manipulated after translation reviews. Richard interrupted sharply. "Enough." The single word echoed through the archive room harder than shouting would have. Vivian did not flinch. "Families lost everything," she continued quietly. "One executive took his own life after the bankruptcy hearings. Another disappeared. Employees were never paid." Adrian felt physically sick hearing it spoken aloud. Richard removed his glasses slowly and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "You were never supposed to see the final documents." Vivian laughed once beneath her breath. Not amusement. Pain. "I translated Arabic, Richard. You forgot that part." Silence crashed heavily between all 3 of them. Outside, distant thunder rolled over Manhattan again. Adrian stared at the man he trusted for over a decade and suddenly realized something unbearable. Richard Lawson had never hidden from him. Adrian simply never looked closely enough. Then Richard spoke quietly toward Vivian again. "You should have stayed gone." Vivian's blue eyes hardened for the first time since Adrian met her. "I tried." Richard looked at her sadly. "And now your sister is going to suffer for your mistakes too." Adrian turned sharply toward Vivian as her face lost all color. The silence after Richard Lawson mentioned Vivian's sister felt heavier than the storm outside. Adrian turned toward Vivian immediately and saw something he had never seen in her before. Fear. Real fear. Not for herself. For someone else. Vivian's fingers tightened against the edge of the metal filing cabinet beside her while the dim emergency lights cast pale shadows across her face. "Leave Emily out of this," she said quietly. Richard's expression remained calm. Too calm. "I tried to," he replied. "You were the one who reopened old doors." Adrian stepped forward slowly. "What does her sister have to do with any of this?" Richard looked at Adrian almost sympathetically. "You still do not understand the situation you are standing in." Vivian moved between them before Richard could continue. "Do not listen to him." But Adrian was already listening differently now. Every sentence. Every silence. Every hidden reaction. "Explain it," Adrian said firmly. Richard sighed softly and removed a thin folder from inside his coat. 4 years ago, Vivian copied internal acquisition records after discovering altered translations tied to Keller Global operations overseas. Adrian stared at Vivian. She did not deny it. "I was going to report it," she whispered. Richard nodded once. "And that would have destroyed the company publicly overnight. Because the company deserved consequences." Richard's eyes hardened slightly for the first time. "No, because thousands of innocent employees would have suffered for decisions they never made." Adrian felt trapped between 2 truths he could no longer separate cleanly. Vivian looked toward him now, her voice lower. "I never wanted money from this. I only wanted it to stop." Richard opened the folder slowly and removed several age documents filled with Arabic and English legal text. "Instead," he said quietly, "you disappeared with confidential material connected to international clients." Vivian's face tightened with contained emotion. "I disappeared because someone followed my sister home from school." Adrian's chest went cold instantly. Richard closed the folder carefully. "Nobody touched her. Because I surrendered the files." The room fell silent again. Somewhere above them, pipes rattled softly through the old building walls, while rain tapped faintly against distant windows. Adrian looked at Vivian differently now. For years hiding. Working double shifts. Living quietly beneath the radar. Not because she was guilty. Because she had been protecting her younger sister the entire time. Vivian looked away toward the dark shelves lining the archive room. "I gave back every document except one." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. "That was a mistake." Adrian immediately focused on her. "What document?" Vivian hesitated. Then she stepped toward another filing cabinet near the back wall and inserted the old brass key with shaking fingers. The cabinet clicked open slowly. Inside rested a single sealed envelope wrapped in clear protective plastic. Adrian watched Richard carefully. For the first time all night, tension finally appeared beneath the older man's controlled expression. Vivian removed the envelope gently. This file contains the original Dubai acquisition translations before they were altered. Adrian felt his pulse thudding harder now. Proof. Real proof. Vivian looked directly at him. Your signature is nowhere inside the illegal revisions. Richard closed his eyes briefly, as if exhausted by the entire conversation. Because Adrian did not know. Adrian stared at him in disbelief. Richard opened his eyes again. You built Keller Global through ambition. I protected it through methods. You preferred not to examine too closely. Adrian felt physically sick hearing the words spoken aloud. Not because Richard lied to him. Because part of him suddenly feared Richard might be telling the truth. Vivian stepped beside Adrian quietly. That is why he needed people like me invisible, she said softly. People who translated the damage but were never important enough to matter afterward. Adrian looked down at the sealed envelope in her hands. Years of silence. Fear. Ruined lives. Hidden beneath ordinary paper. Then headlights suddenly flashed violently through the front windows again. Much brighter this time. All three of them turned instinctively toward the entrance. Multiple black SUVs had stopped outside the building. Doors opened almost simultaneously beneath the rain. Richard's expression changed instantly. You should not have come here tonight, he whispered. Adrian frowned sharply. Who are they? But Vivian already knew. Her face had gone completely pale as she stared toward the entrance. They are not here for you, she said softly. They are here for the file. The black SUVs outside Hawthorne Archive Services remained motionless beneath the rain, while white headlights cut through the darkness like searchlights. Adrian Keller stood frozen beside Vivian Hale, watching shadows move behind tinted windows. Nobody exited immediately. Somehow that felt worse. Quiet power was always more dangerous than loud power. Richard Lawson slowly removed his glasses again, exhaustion written across his face for the first time all night. They tracked the file faster than I expected, he murmured. Adrian turned sharply toward him. Who are they? Richard looked toward the rain-covered windows. People connected to the original Dubai transfer network. Vivian tightened her grip on the sealed envelope. You told them? Richard's jaw shifted slightly. I warned them you were becoming reckless. Vivian gave a hollow laugh beneath her breath. Reckless. Her blue eyes glistened under the weak amber lights. I spent 4 years hiding in cafes and restaurants because I was afraid they would find my sister. Adrian watched her carefully. The calm waitress from the Grand Mercer felt very far away now. This was the real Vivian. Tired. Brilliant. Quietly carrying fear for years without letting it destroy her kindness. One SUV door finally opened outside. 2 men stepped into the rain wearing dark coats, moving calmly toward the building entrance. Adrian's instincts sharpened instantly. We need to leave. Richard shook his head slowly. There is nowhere safe tonight. Vivian suddenly looked at Adrian with surprising clarity. Yes, there is. Adrian frowned. What are you talking about? Vivian stepped closer and placed the sealed envelope directly into his hands. Adrian stared down at it instinctively. It felt strangely light considering how many lives it could destroy or protect. Take it, she whispered. Adrian looked back up immediately. No, Vivian's expression softened faintly. You still think this is only about your company. The front entrance rattled sharply somewhere down the hallway. Not violent. Controlled. Someone trying the locked door carefully. Adrian felt tension flood the archive room. Richard closed his eyes briefly before speaking again. Adrian, listen carefully. If that file becomes public the wrong way, governments, banks, and international investors will tear Keller Global apart before the truth is fully understood. Adrian stared at him coldly. You are still trying to protect the company. Richard opened his eyes slowly. I am trying to protect innocent employees from collapsing with it. Silence settled again. Complicated silence. Adrian hated that part most. Nobody here was entirely clean anymore. Not Richard. Not himself. Maybe not even Vivian. But only one person in the room had sacrificed everything without asking for power in return. Vivian stepped toward the dark window and watched the figures outside moving closer through the rain. I was angry for a long time, she said softly. At Richard. At Keller Global. At all of it. Adrian remained silent. Vivian glanced back toward him. Then my sister got sick. Her voice almost broke on the last word, but somehow stayed steady anyway. And suddenly survival mattered more than revenge. Adrian looked at the envelope in his hands again. Years of corruption, fear, secrets, all hidden inside ordinary paper while rain whispered softly against broken windows. Then Vivian smiled faintly for the first time that night. Small, sad, honest. That is the strange thing about pain, she whispered. It either makes people cruel, or it teaches them how to protect others quietly. The entrance lock finally snapped open somewhere down the hallway. Adrian looked toward the sound instantly. Richard stepped forward calmly. Go, he said quietly. Adrian stared at him in disbelief. What? Richard adjusted his gray coat one final time. You still have time to decide what kind of man you are going to become after tonight. Adrian's pulse slowed. Richard, take Vivian and leave. Vivian looked shocked. Why are you helping us? Richard gave a tired smile that looked 20 years older than before. Because despite everything, you were right about one thing. He looked toward Adrian carefully. Powerful men stop seeing damage when nobody forces them to look down. Footsteps echoed closer through the building. Adrian instinctively reached for Vivian's hand without thinking. She looked startled for half a second before holding on tightly. Together they moved toward the rear exit while thunder rolled softly above Manhattan. And behind them, beneath the fading amber lights of the old archive room, Adrian Keller finally understood something money had never taught him. The most dangerous people in the world were not always the loudest ones. Sometimes they were simply the quiet people who chose to tell the truth anyway.